Hey guys, so today I'm here with Dr. Philip Chase. He's a professor of English at is it Country College of Morris or County College?
County, yes, County College of Morris. Yep.
Okay, awesome. So I've encountered a lot of really good fantasy booktubers, but I think Philip brings something unique to the table, in that he's like an actual scholar on the subject of literature, and he brings like a professorial and, of course, his own unique outlook on literature and in a booktube sort of format. I've really enjoyed his videos about the origins of fantasy, his taste in fiction, and his thoughts on the genre. So yeah, this is Philip Chase, everyone.
Hi, everybody. And I'd just like to thank you, Miles, for inviting me onto your channel. It's a privilege to be here and discuss fantasy with you. It's one of my favorite things about BookTube is getting together with other booktubers. So this is really fun and exciting for me. And thank you.
Well, thank you for coming on. It's exciting for me as well. I think this is the first time I've interviewed someone on YouTube. Yeah, it is. So this should be fun. So let me start sort of at the beginning, I guess. So what made you sort of want to become an English professor?
Well, I actually have a fantasy related answer to that question. It's Tolkien, actually. So when I was around 12, maybe 13, I just got so engrossed in Tolkien's, particularly Lord of the Rings, but I also love The Hobbit and The Silmarillion. And I decided at some point or other that I wanted to write books like that, because I was incredibly moved by the experience. And so over the years, I just sort of formed the impression that to become a great fantasy writer, you had to know a whole bunch of old languages because of Tolkien. So I got interested in Old English and Old Norse while I was in college. And I had the opportunity to learn those and had a really fun time. And from there, actually, I got interested in more and more in literature. So I am actually, my PhD is in medieval literature. I'm a medievalist technically, although fairly unusual in my PhD program is stressed a lot of interdisciplinarity. It's unusual at that level to have that. Most people are very narrow and specialized when they're doing their PhDs. But I had the opportunity to study comparative mythology, and because of the nature of my dissertation, I also had the opportunity to read a lot of 19th century literature. And so I've a fairly broad English education in that sense. And the 19th century English literature was also because of my dissertation, which was partly on 19th century medievalism. So, but I won't go on too long about that. I don't want to bore your viewers too much. But yeah, so from there, I figured out that I wanted to go to grad school, and eventually I discovered that I love teaching. Teaching is absolutely the best way to learn anything is to teach. And I've really enjoyed what I've learned over the years from my students. And that led to eventually to me starting a fantasy novels course where I teach at County College of Morris. And that has been one of the most fun experiences of my teaching life. I've really enjoyed interacting with my students and again, learning from them and the conversations we have around some of the great fantasy. And you quickly realize when you're teaching fantasy, how much there is to say. There's some wonderful fantasy with some great themes out there. And fantasy really, in my opinion, deserves a lot more critical attention. It deserves a lot of respect as a literary mode because of what it uniquely is able to do, in my opinion. And so I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about that. But so that's why I started the YouTube channel actually as well, because I felt like there should be more spaces for people to discuss fantasy in a way that is critical meaning in a scholarly way. And there's so much to be said about the genre and individual works within it. So it's been a little over a year since I started this. And when I started, I actually thought maybe nobody's ever done this before. There must be no, booktube channels about fantasy, right? There's a fair number of us out there, which is great because I've really enjoyed becoming part of this community. So that's probably a long answer to your question.
It's a good answer. For sure. That's the history, the Old English, that sort of stuff is really interesting to me, and the ties it has with fantasy. And yeah, like it's such a big frustration to me is like the amount of people who just, if there's magic in it, even if there's some sort of action in it, they're like, oh no, it's bad.
Right.
Only old books where nothing happens are good. And of course, those books are also good, but it's just not that I've
I
read
know
a
what you
ton,
mean. Yeah.
but
It
it's
has a lot
just,
to do with the history of literature too, and the emergence of realism as an ideal
yeah,
for serious fiction in the late 1700s or so. The reaction against, because fantasy is the oldest mode of storytelling, really. When you go back and you look at the oldest recorded stories, they're all fantasy in some sense.
yeah. And fantasy is such a unique way to talk about certain themes and struggles that you might not be able to do in quite the same way in some other genres.
Precisely. Yeah.
So going off of that, can you sort of walk through like the history of the fantasy genre?
Sure. Yeah. And feel free to interrupt me or chime in or add to whatever I have to say along the way. But so, as we said, fantasy has something in common with myth and legends and ancient lore. And so I think they emerge from the same kind of need. I think human beings have a need for storytelling. We are the creatures who tell stories. We may be the only ones who tell stories. And that is one thing that makes us human, this capacity to imagine that which not is. And fantasy, in my mind, is the genre that does that like no other. But it does have a lot in common with these old myths and stories, which, as you know, have been around as long as human beings have been around telling stories, going way back. You think of some of the classics like the Iliad and the Odyssey, or in South Asia, the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, or the Norse myths and the sagas. And these obviously these stories were meeting several important needs for centuries and centuries. And mostly they were told in an oral formulaic context. They grew out of an oral, so you'd have a bard telling the story and that sort of thing, like Beowulf, right? Eventually, of course, literacy came into the equation, and many of these old oral forms of storytelling were brought into the era of literacy almost wholesale. I mean, if you look at Beowulf, which obviously is a product of literacy because it's written down, it still bears many hallmarks of oral formulaic tales. So it's important to note that these are collective in nature. The person who wrote down Beowulf took the story, which had evolved over centuries, and was ultimately the inspiration for this individual who recorded this story. But the story was much older. It had been around a long time. And so it was part of it's a collective thing. And that's a distinction between myth and modern fantasy. So when you're talking about myths and legends and that sort of thing, these are things that belong to a people, they belong to a culture, and they have evolved over time. Fantasy, I think of as being a more modern creation, which is something that an individual makes up. And another distinction there is that in the case of the myths and the legends, on some level or other, perhaps people actually believed in the beings that they told the stories about, whereas a modern fantasy writer obviously should know that he or she is making these things up. And so those are two important distinctions, I think, when we
Mhm.
talk about the similarity between myth and folk tales and legends to fantasy. I think it's important to mention those two things. That one, the myth and stuff, that stuff is collective in nature. Fantasy is an individual's dream.
Yeah.
So, but it takes inspiration from the old stories. So that is important. But as we were saying, these myths and legends were the dominant form of storytelling for centuries and centuries and centuries until kind of the Age of Enlightenment. And then, of course, industrialism came into play, and industrialism brought a lot of the populace into the cities, cutting them off from their traditional ways of life. And so these old stories began to be viewed as relics of the past. And of course, you have, as we said, the predominance of realism as the respectable mode of storytelling, which emerges in the late 18th century or so. So fantasy was out of fashion in a sense.
Yeah.
But you had a counter movement, as I'm sure you and your viewers all know. The Romantic movement is a very important moment here in the history of fantasy, because it reintroduces, or it brought all these old stories back in a way that they became an interest, something to study about the past, something to understand where we had come from. And so you have this renewed interest in these old stories. No accident that Beowulf, for example, was rediscovered and appreciated in the 19th century. So it's an important era. Actually, it really begins also as early as the late 1700s, but you really see it get going in the early 1800s, and it's a fascinating period because you have the emergence of Gothic fiction, which is a predecessor to fantasy and horror as well. I know you do some horror on your channel, right?
Mhm.
The Gothic stuff has a lot in common. So Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto, for example, from the 1764, maybe 1760s anyway, is seen as something along those lines. But it's seen as the first Gothic novel in English. And you have also, very importantly, as part of this movement that's part of Romanticism, the collection of folk tales like Grimm's fairy tales, and not just them, there are others, but that's probably the most famous. So that's important. And you have all this stuff going on. And it's in some ways a counter movement against industrialism, against capitalism. It is, in a way, there's a lot of idealizing of the past, particularly the medieval past. So you have people looking back at the Middle Ages and saying, oh, wasn't it nice back then because you had this symbiotic relationship between the classes and they took care of each other and everybody knew one another, instead of everyone living in these horrible cities where people don't know one another and they die from, all kinds of horrible diseases that result from urban life and working in these awful factories, and where capitalism means the total exploitation of the weak by the powerful. So you had a lot of people thinking along those lines in the 19th century, people like Thomas Carlyle and John Ruskin, and eventually William Morris. So all this stuff is going on, and you have eventually people starting not just to collect fairy tales, but to start writing them. And an early example of that is Sarah Coleridge, who wrote a kind of a fairy tale in English. And she's the daughter, by the way, of the famous poet, the Romantic poet, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And so that's an important moment, and because we recognize that as perhaps one of the first fantasies ever. I think it's in the 1830s that she wrote that. But there's also George Mcdonald. I don't know if you've heard of him before, but he wrote in the late 1850s, I believe, what's recognized as the first adult fantasy. So it's 1859, and it's Phantastes. And he was an inspiration, by the way, for C.S. Lewis, and on some level as well, J.R.R. Tolkien. So he's important, George MacDonald. And then you have William Morris. I mentioned his name a little earlier, and he is really, to me, the first to write what we recognize as just pure invented fantasy worlds. And he wrote a bunch of these. They didn't have the word fantasy, by the way, back then. That was not really coined until 1949. So they didn't call it fantasy. He called his fantasies prose romances. And he had bits of poetry in there as well. But they were fictional worlds. And he wrote these in the late 1880s and early to 1990s. So one might be the Water of the Wondrous Isles, or The Well Beyond the World, or the House of the Wolfings is one of the first ones, and The Story of the Glittering Plain. There's quite a few of them. But these were, what I was saying before about the social critique is important, because William Morris actually was ultimately became a socialist, and he was very critical of capitalism and industrialism. He, along with others like John Ruskin, believed that industrialism and capitalism had ruined art and had created, as I said before, these terrible conditions in which people didn't care about one another. So he had this ideal kind of medieval inspired society that he wanted to kind of go back to. And he wrote about such societies in his stories. Usually there's some evil urban society that the hero has to somehow get through or conquer or whatever, and defend his own agrarian traditional society. So something along those lines. So he wrote those, and he was a major source of inspiration for J.R.R. Tolkien. And we know this for a fact because Tolkien wrote about William Morris in his letters. And he was most certainly a very specific source of inspiration for several things that you find in Lord of the Rings. So I don't know if you want to interject anything at this point, but that's up until, I think most people understand fantasy, probably Tolkien and after, but this is all going on before Tolkien.
It's really interesting how even from the beginning, the very beginning of the fantasy genre, there were those themes that come back in so much other fantasy. I feel like there's not as much like pro-feudalism fantasy now, but like just the theme of like nature and the bad parts of moving away from being closer to nature and destroying
very
the
much
environment.
so. And that isn't something you definitely see in Tolkien. I mean, it's huge in Tolkien. Who makes all the machines? The orcs, right? The twisted people like Saruman. You know, they're the ones who are into machines and industrialism, and there's the whole scouring of the Shire, right? That's Tolkien expressing his pain at the rural countryside of England becoming industrialized. You know, so that's very big in Tolkien, absolutely. But before Tolkien, even there were other fantasy writers, very important ones like Lord Dunsany, for example, who's famous for his very archaic prose. And you have the development of pulp magazines. That's before Tolkien too. So you have writers like Robert E. Howard, the writer of Conan, among other things. Were first published in these pulp magazines, like Weird Tales and that sort of thing. So, and eventually the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. So they're very important. The sword and sorcery stuff, especially, these owes its origins in some sense to these pulp magazines. So that stuff was all going on as well. But it really takes off, I think you can say, with Tolkien. I mean, he was certainly, I don't think you could argue this, that he was the greatest popularizer of the genre so far anyway. But he wrote The Hobbit in the 1930s, and then The Lord of the Rings came out in the 1950s. And they just proved immensely appealing to a large audience. I think there are still polls that show that the most, I forget exactly what it is, but one of the most popular or best-selling books of the 20th century is The Lord of the Rings. So I'm sure you'd find various ways to phrase that, but it was big. Let's just put it that way. And it's been hugely influential. Not that there aren't other modes of fantasy writing. There certainly are. There are those people who deliberately wrote in a different vein from Tolkien. You know, you have lots of writers who, like Michael Moorcock, for example. He famously is sort of anti-Tolkien. Or you have Stephen Donaldson, with Lord Fowle's Bane in 1977, deliberately taking a very different path than a Tolkien path. And of course, you have a lot of the Tolkien imitators like Terry Brooks with the Sword of Shannara and all of that, which is, I think most people recognize as a Tolkien imitation. And you have all the way into the 70s, 80s, and even, in 1990, you have the first book in the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, The Eye of the World, which I think even hardcore fans of the Wheel of Time, and I consider myself a fan of the series, but it's a very Tolkienian book. The first book is, the rest of the series goes elsewhere, but Tolkien's influence is vast, so, and then, we're in an era at this point, though, where I think most of your viewers and will sort of recognize a lot of the titles and the names. Yeah. Some of my favorites too, by the way, as early as the late 60s, like Ursula Le Guin, are continuing this tradition of fantasy as social critique. So I think that's very important, that fantasy always has had this sort of vein in it of social critique and also psychological insight. So
Yeah. What was I gonna say? It's just I haven't read all of the Earthsea books, but I remember reading the first one a few years back, and it's just, it's a kid's book, but it's, like many fantasy kids books, it's just, it's entertaining for older people to read as well, just because of the themes and the character work and
absolutely,
just the story in general.
Yeah, and that is a book that actually it was billed originally as a children's book because it was fantasy, which is, I think, another disservice that has been done to the genre over the years, just sort of lumping all fantasy as children's books. I think now I've taught this book in my fantasy novels class, and honestly, college students can struggle with a Wizard of Earthsea. Its prose is fairly sophisticated compared to a lot of what other people read these days. So I don't think of it as a children's book anymore, even. But it's interesting because it is not the one that you have to go later in the Earthsea books to see where her social criticism comes into play and her feminism, particularly in Tehanu, the fourth book in the Earthsea books, and some of the short stories as well. So it even took her a little while to, feel like she could include some social commentary in her books too. So
one of the earlier fantasy books to have a person of color as the protagonist too.
That's right, Ged.
I see so much art of him, and they make him white, and I'm like, what?
Yeah.
But no.
Yeah. That's unfortunate. And they did that, I think, in the sci-fi series that you may not have even heard of. You're probably too young. But there was Sci-Fi Channel did a series that was based on the Earthsea books, and it was, first of all, it was awful, and don't watch it. But I think they whitewashed Ged in there as well, and that was one of the objections I think that Le Guin had, because she was very particular in stating that her protagonist and most of the people in that world were darker skinned. So absolutely, you're right. Yep.
It'd be interesting to see like a faithful adaptation of that, whether it's as a show or a movie. There's the Ghibli one that I only saw part of because it was so bad.
Yeah.
It
has not had a great adaptation as yet. But I agree, it would be great to see one.
Yeah. Speaking of like minority characters, diversity in fantasy, there's like more recent fantasy history, I guess. There's been sort of a rise, I think, especially in Asian-based fantasy, but other places as well, like African sort of based fantasy. And I remember hearing it's sort of started with a lot of like self-publishing authors writing more based on their cultures rather than European, and that sort of popularized it. And now it's more
Yeah.
published in traditional publishing. And of course, there's the influence of Avatar, The Last Airbender, that kind of stuff as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, there's Evan Winter's Rage of Dragons, first book that's The Burning. This is a series. I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to read it, I hope, this year. I have read the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang as an example of an Asian-inspired setting. And there are lots of others that are coming out, and that authors that I need to read, and I'm excited to get to. Fantasy is becoming more and more diverse, and I think that is a wonderful thing in terms of the portrayal and the inclusion of authors of color and women and people of different sexual orientations. You're seeing all these things portrayed more and more, and I think it's a good thing for the genre. It's bringing new life into the genre. Absolutely. One of my favorite authors in the genre is the author of the Broken Earth trilogy, N.K. Jemisin. And I think that her social critique in there is absolutely brilliant. It's just wonderful stuff. And I love that you can have social critique in fantasy. And it's actually very effective there, because what we're doing here is we're placing the critique, or we're placing the psychological insights in a different context where we can wrestle with them, right? It might be a little easier to wrestle with them in that other place, in that imaginary world, and then bring that back into our own lives. And fantasy is wonderful for that.
The great thing with good fantasy too is it tackles so many like different ideas and themes, but if it's done well, and it often is, it doesn't like feel preachy or like
Yeah.
forceful of the idea. It's more of a discussion, and usually it's not like an analogy. There's this sort of thing with J.R.R. Tolkien talking about analogy, and C.S. Lewis being like all about it.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's, it can be a fine line, but it's great how fantasy can have those themes, but not, be
Not
forceful.
be heavy-handed. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
but you're absolutely right. You don't want to preach at your readers. That's for sure. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think the best authors know how not to do that, and how to still incorporate these themes into their writing without hitting you over the head with them. I love C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, but they can be a little heavy-handed in their allegory at times. I think even Tolkien remarked on that. Whereas Tolkien was not a fan of allegory, and he preferred people not to interpret his stories allegorically. So
he was, I know there's a sort of confusion out there about that, because he said he doesn't like allegory, but he's fine with applicability.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. In his essay on fairy tales, which everyone should read, actually. Good essay.
I want to, not anytime soon, I don't think, but sometime I want to reread the Narnia books, because I haven't read them since I was a kid. And like,
Yeah.
I didn't notice any of the
Uh-huh.
allegory everybody's talking about. Last year, I reread The Horse and His Boy, which is maybe the most forgotten of those.
Yeah.
And I liked it a lot. I thought, right now it might be my favorite of the Narnia books.
Uh-huh.
I don't know, it's very different from the rest of the series, and yeah.
Yeah. I love those books. They're very nostalgic for me, and probably for a lot of people too. Yeah.
Yeah. I just remember growing up and listening to the audiobooks of them like all the time.
And as just another example of what we were talking about, of really great fantasy that that incorporates themes, the series that if you've been at all looking at my channel, that I've been immersing myself in and really enjoying, is the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which I consider to be a masterpiece. I think this is something that people should be reading 50 years from now, 100 years from now. This is just brilliant stuff. And fantasy is a genre that supports that. And if you're at all interested in writing fantasy, I think you should take Steven Erickson's advice, which is read broadly. Just don't read just fantasy. If you want to be a great fantasy writer, you have to read all kinds of great writers outside the genre. Read broadly and give yourself that treat of reading authors with a lot of depth, reading the classics, even the realism ones, the boring ones where nothing happens. So there's just a lot to learn from them, and incorporate that stuff in your fantasy. And that, I think, is a winning combination.
Yeah. Speaking of like the boring stuff that never happens, is actually like sometimes like my favorite kind of story, which kind of contradicts my attitude earlier. But like,
Sure.
I'm a big advocate for like stories not always having to follow this rigid hero's arc or just a rigid structure.
Yes.
I'm a
Yes.
firm believer that there's like pretty much no rules to storytelling, just guidelines that you should probably follow, but you don't have to. And some
Yeah.
of my favorites are sort of like Lady Bird, like coming of age, sort of slice of life type stories.
Yeah. Yeah, that's brilliant. Is that the one they made the film out of? Is that
It was just a film.
Oh, it was just a film. Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
because I'm only familiar with the film. Yeah, good. Yeah, good stuff. Yeah, so yeah, I think Erickson is an author you might like then in that case, because he definitely breaks the rules. He set out to upend tropes, which is a great thing, because I think that there is a temptation for people who are not familiar with fantasy to see it as a very trope-driven genre, which is less and less the case. And the tropes have a purpose. They're there, they exist. And if they're handled well, they can be a lot of fun. But it's also possible for us to be in a rut, isn't it? And to repeat these tropes in a way that is not reflecting. And so you have a lot of, I think, authors who are beginning to respond to these tropes and do something different with them, or even go their own path. So you have lots of good examples of that. But the one that I've been really invested in these days is the Malazan world, which is really worked for me.
Yeah, I've heard about that series. I'm definitely interested.
Yeah.
Knowing me, I'll probably read it sometime in the nearish future.
Yep.
I know it's supposed to be very different.
Yeah.
Read like the first page because I was curious. I was like, wow, this is very unusual, but
Yeah, his
I like
prose is
unusual.
brilliant. Yeah, it is unusual. It's a series that incorporates horror elements, which is fun if you're into horror too.
Mm-hmm.
So particularly in the short stories, the Bocalane and Corbel Broach short stories, and in some of the stories written by Erickson's partner in creating the world, Ian Esselmont. I just read the first book in the Novels of the Malazan Empire by Ian Esselmont and Night of Knives. And that is it got a lot of horror elements in it too. So there's another thing about, we've been talking about fantasy, but I think it's true. A lot of the really great authors will just ignore the genre boundaries and will incorporate horror in there. Like look at Stephen King, for example. I'm reading the Dark Tower series, and what is it actually? Is it fantasy? Or there's some science fiction. There's horror certainly in there, but it's kind of tough to categorize. So
yeah, I read the first one last year.
Yeah.
Very strange.
Yeah. Are you a King reader, by the way?
Yeah, I'm kind of more new King reader, but I've quickly become a fan of his. I think I've read like maybe 6 of his books, which is not a big portion of his collection. So I'm looking forward to reading more and more. But he's already really sort of influenced my own writing a lot with his style, and I don't know, his writing has given me a lot of inspiration.
Cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
so you do horror, but you also write poems, is that right?
Yeah. I came out, I self-published a collection of horror stories and some poetry recently. And it was definitely, I wrote it sort of the first half of 2020. Um, so it's definitely inspired a lot by Stephen King and some of his ideas, and his writing style, his prose style.
Oh, I love his prose. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I didn't read King for a long time until very recently because I assumed, well, he's so popular. Maybe, it sounds awful, doesn't it? That I would be so snobby. But I just kind of thought, okay, popular author must not be that great. But he's got great prose. I love it. And his portrayal of people is just unflinching and interesting. I love his characters so far in the Dark Tower series. I'm absolutely a fan. I put it in my top 10 fantasy series because I'm so impressed with his writing and his characters.
His
So
character work is some of the best I've read,
yeah,
just how he really gets into people's heads, and it just feels like you're reading about a real person, and it can be
yeah,
uncomfortable at times just because he's so,
yeah.
like, he gets in there.
He's visceral. I mean,
Yeah.
he gets into the the dirt and gets to break down to the most primal stuff about us. So I mean,
I
if you
think
like that, he's brilliant.
I think that is something that I like a lot. But I think a lot of people don't, not to sound all edgy and stuff, but like they just
Yeah,
don't get it. Like
yeah,
they see that and they're like, oh, this is crude, pulp, whatever, who cares?
right.
Uh, but he has he writes sort of in a often visceral way, a graphic way for a reason.
Yeah, yes, yeah. I
Because
think he's
sometimes
brilliant.
you can't portray certain things without being more visceral about it. And
Yeah. And he was kind of doing grimdark before grimdark was a thing, I guess, right? I mean, it was there are some things in common there. And I'm speaking of grimdark, of course, we didn't mention this yet, but there's all kinds of fantasy these days, right? There's
mhm,
military fantasy, romantic fantasy, historical fantasy, YA, and I don't know, steampunk, whatever. I mean, there's so many different kinds of fantasy now, and grimdark being, I think, one of the more important ones these days,
mhm.
in terms of it's where it's taking a different route from what it would call classical fantasy. In classical fantasy, you tend to have a sort of good and evil, and you know who's who more or less. Although some characters might, some good characters might have to, fight temptation and that sort of thing. But there's a higher authority that basically the good people are going to follow the moral high road, and the bad ones are not. And grimdark is, I think, the morality, it comes from a different place there. It has a world where there's the moral center just doesn't exist so much, and it's a struggle. You live in a universe that is basically meaningless, but I love what it does with its characters who are just there trying to, struggle through this and create meaning, carve some meaning out of this world. So that's something admirable and probably, I guess, existentialist, right? So
Mhm.
yeah,
It's become really popular, especially with the show Game of Thrones,
yes,
through the
yep,
past decade or so. And I think a lot of it has to do with both. It's just like it's appealing and it's good and it's well written, but also um, I feel like there has been a rise in sort of existentialism and
yep,
people thinking about morality as more of a gray thing,
yep, yep.
and
That's
it
absolutely right.
matches the times.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. And it goes back to, again, you can trace these things back there. People would say grimdark begins more with like David Gemmell and Michael Moorcock and others who were sort of anti-Tolkien in a way, back in the day. But certainly you see it in modern authors like Mark Lawrence, and Joe Abercrombie is labeled as grimdark. Although I think he's a little less grimdark, honestly, than Mark Lawrence. But we'll keep Lord Grimdark in the grimdark genre.
Mm-hmm.
So cool. So anything else? We've done pretty well here, I think, so far, discussing the origins and development of the genre. I'm sure we've left out a few things like gaming, for example. Dungeons and Dragons and the role that played is obviously tremendous. I can't remember exactly when D&D started. I know when I started playing D&D, it was in the early to mid 80s. And I
think that's when it came out. Yeah,
I think right about then. So it was a big deal, and I think it has influenced a whole generation or more of fantasy authors as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear people talk about the influence of D&D on different fantasy books. Going back to, this is sort of branching away, but going back to talking about non-fantasy, what are some of your favorite non-fantasy books?
Oh, wow. There's so many. I mean, I said I'm a medievalist, so, but I guess I included Beowulf and all that stuff in fantasy earlier, didn't I? So, but I do love, the old stuff and the myths and all that stuff. I love reading myths from around the world. But in terms of more modern reading, I do actually, in my work, I teach into literature. So I have the opportunity to read a lot of different modern writers as well, from 19th and 20th centuries. And so I've tried to branch out, and challenge myself by reading some of those outside of teaching as well. So it's a long list, but you'd recognize a lot of the names, I'm sure. But outside of fiction, I also like to read. So I'm definitely not a scientist, but I love to read books written by scientists for little. So if you know what I mean. So Stephen Hawking wrote his books about the book about the universe. What is it? A Brief History of Time, I think it's called.
Something like that.
I love that sort of thing. I love reading about the brain. I've read some interesting books about the brain, and I love reading about. And these are things I think that are if you're going to be a writer, you should read stuff like this too. Psychology and Joe Abercrombie, I think he majored in psychology or something, and you can tell because he writes great characters. So you should read about the brain and how it works and all that. And there's what else? I wrote a book about human behavior by a neuroscientist called. His name, Robert Sapolsky. It's called Behave, I think. I like to read all the kinds of philosophy. Within the last year or two, I read a book about Buddhism. So, it's just, I like to be as well-rounded as possible. Read all kinds of stuff. And so, I mean, when I teach Intro to Lit, I teach authors like William Faulkner and James Baldwin, and I teach, what else do I do there? There's, I'm trying to remember the order in which I do all this, but there's Flannery O'Connor, and there's Sandra Cisneros, and there's Alice Walker, and so many great writers. I mean, there's just so many. But yeah, I try to read a diversity of them. So.
Yeah. All right. To sort of, I guess, close things off, where do you see the future of fantasy heading in the next decade or two?
That's a great closing question. So I think we're in a golden age for fantasy. I think the genre is flourishing. As we discussed before, the infusion of diversity into the genre is a wonderful thing. And we're going to see more and more quality writers coming from various backgrounds and incorporating inspirations from various places. So I'm very hopeful about the future of the genre. I'm an optimist in most things, but I think there's plenty of evidence to say that fantasy is at a good time. It's a tricky time too, in one sense, though, because the publishing world is a bit of a mess, frankly, because of the internet and you're a writer, so you know how difficult it is to be published the traditional way these days. It's very, very hard. I think you're probably better off buying a lottery ticket, honestly. But self-publishing has become a thing, and I'm sure there are a million ways to do that wrong and a few ways to do that right, and it's a lot of work as well. And you have to be okay with marketing yourself. So self-publishing is exciting, and it'll be interesting to see where things go. I think, like you mentioned earlier, a lot of those authors coming from diverse backgrounds started out in self-publishing, and they've begun to change the genre. I think it's exciting. I wish that being a writer paid the bills a little better, because most people who write aren't going to be able to just make a living being a writer. You've got to have a day job. But it's still something people do it because we love it, So, and we love the genre, and I think it's a great place to be right now.
For sure. I think I think everybody knows this, but with the introduction of all this new technology, it's just, we're seeing in art in general, there's just way more independence. And it's really taking off and influencing the scene as a whole.
Yep.
Whether it's for literature or music or other forms. Yeah,
which I think is a good thing overall. And I mean, there in traditional publishing, you did have people who were kind of gatekeepers, and that's both a good and a bad thing. Bad in that it kept a lot of people out, and we could get into the politics of that too, I'm sure. But good though, in that there was a quality control to some extent.
For sure.
To some extent. So in self-publishing, it's a little bit harder to have that, So it's. I think that some of the best advice I've seen about self-publishing is, if you're a self-publishing author, you still need to seek out ways to have people look at your work, and you need to edit and hopefully have someone you trust, or even maybe go through, the expenditure of having an actual professional editor look at your work.
For sure.
It's not cheap, but it is something I think if you really want to do your best, you should think about.
Yeah. Having an editor for my book was just changes everything, because they're just so professional. They catch these things that you would never in a million years notice, even if you read your book
little things to big things. And to me, writing should not be a completely individual matter. If you want to write the best book you can, you need feedback. You need that. So
absolutely.
And there'll be possibilities for that in self-publishing too. So exciting times. And I just want to personally wish you great fulfillment in your writing. I think it's wonderful that you're a writer, and I
thank you.
Want, encourage you in that, and keep at it.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much. All right. Well, this has been Philip Chase. I'll have his channel linked down in the description below. Make sure to go check him out. He makes some really interesting and good videos. Thanks so much for hopping on the channel today and having this great discussion.
Thank you, Miles. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I'm looking forward to watching your videos and interacting some more.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much.